SpongeBob SquarePants just turned 18. That is a more confusing sentence than I thought it would be. SpongeBob SquarePants, the show, has now been airing for 18 years. That's a super long time for any show, let alone a cartoon. You know, I'm not entirely convinced that SpongeBob won't just outlive all of us. And then when the heat death of the universe barrels towards a long-forgotten Earth, there will be nothing to stare into the abyss except for the faint, sing-songy whisper of, "I'm ready." Sorry, that kinda got away from me there. What I mean to say is that SpongeBob is pretty old, both the show and the character. At least I think the character is old. Come to think of it, how old is SpongeBob supposed to be? We have a couple of answers here and there, but for every answer, we seem to have a ton of contradictory evidence towards them, which makes a question as simple as SpongeBob's age super complicated. So complicated, in fact, that some people are wondering if SpongeBob really ages at all. Is it possible that SpongeBob SquarePants is actually immortal? Okay, let's first knock the obvious one out of the way. Like we've said before, SpongeBob has been airing for about 18 years, and yet SpongeBob doesn't seem to age. However, this is 100% cartoon logic that we're going to shelf for now, because if we acknowledge this, then we have to acknowledge that this is pretty much the case for everybody else in Bikini Bottom. But SpongeBob in particular has a couple of interesting qualities that make a really good case for him being some sort of ageless being. Putting the rest of the show's continuity and characters aside and looking at SpongeBob in a vacuum, there seems to have been a lot of intentional smoke and mirrors when discussing things like how old he is. As pointed out by Reddit user Nandel SpongeBob has been working at the Krusty Krab for a long time. How long exactly? Well, at the beginning of the 2004 SpongeBob movie, SpongeBob tells Gary that he's won the Krusty Krab's Employee of the Month award 374 consecutive times. Wait a minute, 374 consecutive months? If we're going to be charitable and assume that he's won Employee of the Month for every single month he's worked at the Krusty Krab, that would mean that SpongeBob has been working there for at least 31 years and 2 months. That's definitely longer than I expected. Especially since in the movie, Mr. Krabs tells SpongeBob that the reason he didn't get the manager position at the Krusty Krab 2 is because he's just a kid. And what's more, we can't assume that SpongeBob has been working at the Krusty Krab since the day he was born, which means that his age would have to be 31 plus the rest of his life before the Krusty Krab, if such concepts can even be imagined. So let's take a look at how old the show says SpongeBob is. According to his driver's license, we see that he was born on July 14th, 1986. Well, actually, it just says 86, but I think we're safe in taking the logical leap that it's the 20th century. I mean, David Hasselhoff is alive, so there you go. So if we take that date of birth and then compare it to when the SpongeBob SquarePants movie was released, which is 2004, that would make his age in the movie 18 years old. Alright, I'm calling shenanigans, what's going on here? I say that in a shocking manner, but there actually is an answer that we're going to get to later in this video that has to do with SpongeBob's incredibly in-depth timeline, so sit tight for that. So with all of this opaqueness about how old SpongeBob is there any other evidence that might suggest that SpongeBob is immortal? Well, maybe. For starters, this show has a pretty huge cast of characters. But apart from possibly SpongeBob, the oldest and most ageless of the bunch would probably be King Neptune, and yes, he's exactly who you think he is. He's the Roman god of the sea, who is documented in the show to be about 5,000 years old. Also read, basically immortal, cause he's a god. So it's not like immortality is just a fantastical concept to the characters in the show. After all, they've interacted with characters like this in the SpongeBob universe before, so who's to say that there can't be any others? Granted, Neptune is a god, and SpongeBob is a sponge. Actually, speaking of SpongeBob being a sponge, there's another point that we need to refer to here, and that's the life expectancy of actual sea sponges. The average life expectancy of a sea sponge is about 10 to 20 years. That's pretty good for sponges, and if SpongeBob were 18, then we would be fine, he would just be on the older side, but it doesn't even come close to the 31 years SpongeBob has supposedly worked at the Krusty Krab, let alone any time before that. Also, this is a bit of a minor note, but SpongeBob is an incredibly lucky individual. He's cheated death in this show probably more times than he should have been able to get away with. And I'm not talking like once or twice, I'm not even talking dozens. We're talking like close to 100 times where SpongeBob's life has been in jeopardy. I've been alive for 25 years, and I think my life has been in jeopardy maybe twice? 3 times if you count the pretzel incident. I mean, it's true that on our list we're counting pretty much every time SpongeBob has ever tried to drive, but we're also counting much more dire situations, like when he was ripped in half by a gorilla in I Had an Accident. Not only does he survive, but he also seems to be relatively okay with the whole situation. Granted, though, he might have just been in shock. Either way, it's a little weird because earlier in that episode, he cracks his butt and the doctor tells him that one more injury like that would put him out of commission indefinitely, which would also condemn him to a life in the iron butt, which, to be fair, that's a Marvel series I would totally watch. But could it be possible that SpongeBob is actually far more resilient than any of the other characters? So between the fuzziness about SpongeBob's age, the inconsistencies between SpongeBob's supposed age and the actual life expectancy of real sea sponges, his many near-death experiences, and the presence of literal Roman gods in this world, can we be confident in saying that SpongeBob is immortal and/or invincible? Okay, first let's sort out all of the inconsistencies that we've established with SpongeBob's age. Despite the helpful title cards and the charming French narrator, there's a lot of confusion about how time in this show works, since there's this kind of floating timeline present throughout the whole thing. But at the same time, there's also an incredibly rigid and established timeline. There's even been an effort on the SpongeBob wiki to meticulously document every major event of the series, and it's here that we're going to find our true answer to how old SpongeBob is. But before we answer this, we should acknowledge that SpongeBob creator Stephen Hillenburg has gone on record jokingly saying that he believes SpongeBob to be 50 in sponge years. But he's also said that he doesn't really believe that SpongeBob has a canon age. And if I may speak freely, Mr. Hillenburg, that is a valid stance to take, and I respect your opinion. But that ain't gonna fly for a theory about immortality, so let's try to answer this anyway. So we're going to stick with SpongeBob's driver's license on this one and say that he was born in 1986. The correction in the timeline that we need to make is actually regarding the timing of the 2004 SpongeBob SquarePants movie. When we last tried to math out his age, we were going on the assumption that the movie takes place at the same time that it was released, in 2004. But this actually isn't the case. In fact, the first movie was originally intended to be the end of the show. And Hillenburg has gone on to say that it pretty much still is, and that the movie takes place after the events of the TV show. So this effectively makes the movie a sort of retroactive series finale, even though new episodes are still being made. So this fact actually places the movie much further down the timeline. How much further? Well, the first episode of SpongeBob, Help Wanted, was released on May 1st, 1999. And in this episode, SpongeBob is officially hired to work at the Krusty Krab. From there, if we generously assume that SpongeBob was Employee of the Month for every month since then, that would place the movie 31 years later, around 2030. Granted, this would mean that SpongeBob was hired at the age of 13, but he's very enthusiastic about working at the Krusty Krab. Besides, 13's pretty old for a sea sponge. So after all of that, how old is SpongeBob? With the movie taking place in 2013, that would actually mean that SpongeBob, during the events of this movie, is at least 44 years old. So now the question becomes, why does Mr. Krabs call SpongeBob a kid in the movie? How could a sponge that has so far exceeded the average lifespan of a regular sea sponge still be considered just a kid? Well, keep in mind the context of the scene. Right before, Mr. Krabs was lecturing SpongeBob about how he has a long way to go when it comes to things like maturity. So he was most likely speaking rhetorically when he called him a kid. A bit of a roundabout way to tell somebody that they didn't get the job. But you can't really deny the fact that SpongeBob's demeanor throughout the show doesn't really do much to overturn Mr. Krabs' claim. But there's another major factor that we haven't even touched yet, and that's whether SpongeBob actually is a sea sponge. While most resources say that SpongeBob is a sea sponge, and while we have seen SpongeBob's parents, who are much more sea sponge-like, this only makes it more obvious that SpongeBob looks a lot more like your average kitchen sponge, especially when shown in dried out forms or above the surface of the ocean. Now, if SpongeBob were a kitchen sponge, that would mean that our theory is mostly okay, since artificial man-made sponges don't really have any sort of natural life expectancy. However, it wouldn't account for the amount of times that he's been torn or damaged. So what's the official word on this one? Well, on top of Stephen Hillenburg's well-documented background in marine biology, we can see his original proto-SpongeBob in a comic that he wrote back in 1984 called The Intertidal Zone. This was an informative comic that he wrote and illustrated about various types of marine life, complete with little characters delivering fun facts. And one of these characters was a sea sponge that A, amazingly, went by the name Bob the Sponge, and B, sea looks an awful lot more like a sea sponge than the SpongeBob that we know today. Considering that the characters of this comic were eventually developed into SpongeBob SquarePants, it seems pretty likely that SpongeBob is definitively a sea sponge. And that's not even mentioning that Hillenburg once said that part of the reason he decided to focus on a character like SpongeBob is because sponges are, quote, the weirdest animal. Notice how he didn't say that they were the weirdest artificial kitchen tool or anything like that. So with that established, while we've already looked at the average life expectancy of sea sponges, are there any more variables we can take into account here? Hillenburg said himself, they're weird animals, so do they possess any sort of life-prolonging abilities that would contribute to SpongeBob's supposed immortality? To start, it's worth mentioning that while the average lifespan of a sponge is about 20 years, that doesn't mean that there aren't any outliers. I mean, there are over 5,000 different species of sponge that we've discovered. I say we as in like the greater scientific community. I have not discovered any sponges except for, you know, the ones in my kitchen. So naturally, certain sponge classifications can live way longer. And I'm not talking like an extra 5 years or something. Some sponges that have been discovered, like the giant barrel sponge, can live upwards of hundreds to thousands of years. In fact, there's even more we can infer from the great barrel sponge. Because along with being able to live that long, they're also surprisingly common in relatively shallow depths, ranging from about 33 feet or 10 meters to about 390 feet or 120 meters. And they're also most common in tropical or Caribbean reefs. Both the depth and the location are almost a perfect match for SpongeBob SquarePants. So there actually is a precedent for long-living sea sponges in these kinds of settings. But there is one big problem, because isn't there always one? Take a look at the giant barrel sponge. As the name suggests, it looks like a giant barrel. And SpongeBob, well, he doesn't look like that. Like at all. And based on how his parents look, he's much more likely to be one of those more common varieties of sea sponges with that average 20-year lifespan. But let's talk about how sponges are able to reproduce. While sponges are capable of reproducing sexually, what's far more interesting is how they're able to reproduce asexually, without any sort of second party to speak of. Part of what makes sponges so resilient is their incredible regenerative capabilities. If a sea sponge is fragmented as much as down to its individual cells, those cells will gradually rebuild in order to eventually make yet another fully formed sponge. And that is amazing. They're like Jack Harkness from Doctor Who. Yes, you heard it here first, Jack Harkness is a sponge. But going along with these regenerative capabilities, if a living sponge is, for whatever reason, torn or shattered into a bunch of non-microscopic pieces, those pieces will begin to grow individually, and before you know it, you'll have a whole bunch of spongy clones of your own. Like, if you were a sponge person, which I'm assuming you're not, but if you were and you chopped off your hand, you would grow your hand back, but also your hand would grow a whole other person attached to it. I mean, it's kind of a silly comparison because sponges are much simpler organisms compared to humans, but that's the basic idea. So in SpongeBob's case, he would have the ability to reconstitute himself in the event of a traumatic injury. And furthermore, if SpongeBob lost a chunk of himself forever, he would not only grow that chunk back, but that chunk would also grow its very own SpongeBob. Now, I know that that's not quite the same thing as immortality. If I cloned myself and then my clones made clones of themselves, that wouldn't make me immortal. That would just make the general concept of me functionally immortal. But still, even if it is just conceptual, you gotta give some points to the theory for that. And that's not even mentioning SpongeBob's virtual indestructibility. SpongeBob may die, but his clones live on. Is it possible that this supposedly 44-year-old SpongeBob is actually a collection of clones that have resulted from the various near-death experiences past SpongeBobs have encountered? Heck, when he was split in two and I had an accident, both of his halves seem to keep the same personality. So who's to say that any stray chunks of SpongeBob wouldn't have grown into physically and emotionally identical SpongeBobs? It would also explain more clearly why in the 2004 film Mr. Krabs calls SpongeBob just a kid. Because he is. He's the last in a long line of clones that have replaced past SpongeBobs. This theory has a surprising amount of evidence on both sides when it comes to determining whether or not SpongeBob is immortal. In one column, while we've cleared up the confusion with SpongeBob's age, there's still no accounting for things like a literal god in the universe of the show that might contribute towards an ageless character. But at the same time, even though we've only been looking at SpongeBob being immortal, we do also have to make the same consideration for everyone else in the series, since none of them seem to age any faster than SpongeBob does. Even if it is cartoon logic, it still stands as a point against this theory. But if we also consider the science and the regenerative qualities of sea sponges, there are a lot of different conclusions that you could draw. flaw. It's actually incredibly likely that there have been multiple SpongeBobs that are replacing each other due to his regenerative and cloning abilities, granting him to some level either functional or conceptual immortality depending on how you want to interpret it. So with that in mind, I'm going to rate the conspiracy of SpongeBob being immortal 224 consecutive Employee of the Month awards out of 374. But the graphic below me can just say 3 out of 5, because that's way easier. But what do you think? Do you think SpongeBob possesses the gift of immortality? Or do you think that Bikini Bottom might be host to a whack of SpongeBob clones? And also, what's your all-time favorite episode of SpongeBob SquarePants that isn't Band Geeks, because that's just objectively the best episode? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments, and also be sure to let us know of any conspiracies you'd like us to take a look at a later date. Also, don't forget to hit that like button if you liked this video, subscribe to Channel Frederator if this is your first time here, and don't forget to click the little bell icon next to the subscribe button to become part of our notification squad so we can let you know right away when we've got something new. And remember, Frederator loves you.